Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's good to be with you again, students of political philosophy. This segment is going to be discussing the work of Thomas Hobbes, especially as unpacked in this book on the history of political philosophy by Cora Karpowitz, chapter 9. Hobbes in the beginning of modernity, this transition from, you could say, traditional political philosophy to what could be called the concept of political science. So Thomas Hobbes, an Englishman living from 1588 to 1679, dies at age 91, very old, especially in that time. He's known to be the founding father of modern political thought. Born into a relatively poor family, his father a clergyman, but also became alcoholic and deserted his family when Thomas was 16 years old. So thinking about that experience itself, I think says a lot what would shape Hobbes's anthropology. Thomas was then supported by his uncle, who was a glove manufacturer. Thomas Hobbes would never marry throughout his life, but would work as a tutor of members of the higher nobility. Thomas Hobbes would come to know Sir Francis Bacon, for whom he acted as secretary from 1618 to 1622. So influenced by one of the great proponents of the scientific revolution, Francis Bacon, Hobbes became disillusioned with Aristotelianism, which was still taught at universities, and with scholasticism. This is a disillusionment that becomes prevalent from his time on to the present. Thomas Hobbes was enamored with geometry and these what seem to be indubitable abstract principles of geometry. Coupled with fear, he admits in his work called Leviathan that himself and fear were born twins. Very interesting. So when we think of a political theory developed out of this underlying sense of fear and suspicion, definitely within the band of political realists, we're not surprised at many of his conclusions. On page 160, again in the Karpowitz book, toward the bottom, reading about Leviathan, published in 1651. In this work, Hobbes showcases a thoroughly materialistic and atheistic philosophy. So if these are our starting points, we might not wonder so much how the human being will be interpreted according to a radical materialist concept and also an atheistic one. When anthropology is not theological anthropology, it seems definitely from a Catholic perspective that we interpret ourselves as less than who we really are as human beings, always in relation to the one who made us, always in relation to the image in who we've been made. We forward then to page 162 at the bottom, this section of New Political Science. That's a key phrase, thinking about, again, political philosophy, not only as built upon previous ages, but coming out of this more scientific worldview. And again, in Thomas Hobbes' case, not so much a radical empiricism or experimental method of political philosophy, but rather one based on geometry as a model and these kind of principles, a deductive form of reasoning that begins with this kind of abstract first principles and deduces the theory from there. But we're going to discover what were his primary principles for his new political philosophy modeled after this kind of geometric science. Again, Francis Bacon very influential in this. And it seems that when we read on page 163, that Hobbes was against all of these dogmatic understandings of reality. He was wanting a method that would purge ourselves from the prejudices and dogmas received from previous philosophers. He wanted, as one commentator says, to become again as a child before nature, not assuming too much, but simply interpreting nature as is, but also given these principles for his political science. So it's hard to really get our minds around exactly what he's up to here. We can't peg him as a pure empiricist, even though we're going to use the word science to describe his political thought. Page 164, in the middle of the page, we read that Hobbes wants to establish society on scientific grounds and free people from the influence of traditional authorities. He believed that the reign of science, upheld by the power of the sovereign, was a way to conceive the polis. He argues that authoritative opinion should be replaced by universally recognized and indisputable science as the basis of civil society. And again, his model is not so much empirical science, but geometry, deductive reasoning, where human beings construct the commonwealth themselves. That politics is a human construct. This is really the beginnings of voluntarism. We'll see with later philosophers like Arthur Schopenhauer and Friedrich Nietzsche, the emphasis on the human will as authoritative. It's also related to the medieval movement of nominalism. And so Hobbes has this modern mechanistic theory of nature, a kind of Baconian, Newtonian concepts of the world as matter in motion. That is all. This kind of worldview would also influence people to come like Scottish philosopher David Hume, and also give birth to this moral philosophy called consequentialism, where Hobbes writes that the knowledge of consequences and dependence of fact upon another defines science. Measured by motion and magnitude, politics is no longer about virtue. It becomes the domain of passions and power. So for Hobbes, this is the physics of political science, human passions and the desire for power, and the manipulation of material goods by human beings. Moving on page 165, the section, The Reality of Conflict. We have a quote from Leviathan, the introduction: "Life is just a movement of limbs." Life is just a movement of limbs. Very mechanistic, deterministic understanding of human beings in relation to the universe. Definitely a certain brand of reductionism in this thought. Further down on page 165, all human beings are thus equalized and reduced to the lowest common denominator. This is Karpowitz's interpretation. Their behavior is determined by their drives, and like natural objects, they are subject to mechanical necessity, moved solely by passions. As human beings become one-dimensional, or at least the interpretation of us here with Hobbes seems rather one-dimensional, as if we're bundles of passions in pursuit of greater power, to be able to live out these passions more freely. This is Hobbes' anthropology. Again, further down on 165, the equality of human beings, rather than being a straightforwardly positive value, is the reason for our enmity. Our enmity. So equals who do not recognize any superiority or natural hierarchy among themselves, and who inevitably compete for goods that are scarce, are prone to conflict. Conflict is automatic because we're equals, and so we compete to try to get, I try to get my share, you try to get your share of things. Hence, conflict and not cooperation is the natural state of humankind, the state of nature, in which human beings live when a political society is absent, is for Hobbes the state of war. The state of war when no mediating, moderating political authority is present is the very state of nature. So this is the justification for having what will be in Hobbes' conception an absolute political authority with absolute power in order to prevent this anarchy of competitive conflict between equal human beings. Page 166, we read about 8 lines down the Hobbesian argument that human relations in the state of nature are characterized by conflict is based on 5 assertions. Cora Karpowitz helps us sort this out and summarize a lot of key points in Hobbes' work. First, people are roughly equal in their mental and physical powers. Second, they are moved by passions, that is, by their appetites or aversions, which are similar for all members of the human race. Third, as egoistic utility maximizers, they are concerned solely with their own benefit. Fourth, they possess no innate notions of right or wrong. And fifth, they are not naturally social, contra Grotius, for one, that Hobbes argues we're not naturally social, but rather individualistic, selfish, egotistical beings. So these would be some of the first principles, you could say, of Hobbes' work upon which his whole political science is based. Further down on 166, toward the bottom of the page, we come together, Hobbes says, not so much for love of our fellows as for love of ourselves. Well, so a very self-interested concept of the human being. And it results in this thoroughgoing struggle for power, every man for himself. Page 167, toward the top. Reason in this paradigm becomes a mere instrument, a calculus of utilities. That's a good way to put it for Hobbes. Reason is a matter of a calculus of utilities, what is most useful, most expedient for the individual. That's where reason is helpful to sort this out. But reason itself for Hobbes is not tethered to any kind of natural law that would promote a collective virtue in the classical concept of virtue, like in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Rationality for Hobbes no more than a reckoning of the consequences of things imagined in the mind. So again, a consequentialist kind of ethics. Rather than stemming from some virtuous activity involving the exercise of reason, for Hobbes, happiness consists in a continual satisfaction of desire, to quote Leviathan, chapter 11, from one object to another. A calculus of self-interest, a mechanical physics of human action. The core of Hobbes' argument is that the passions by which human beings are led in an environment of anarchy both diminish the possibility of cooperation. There are three powerful motives, again, among these first principles of Hobbes' political science, three powerful motives by which individuals are driven. First, competition. Second, diffidence. Diffidence means a lack of trust, a mistrust in other people. So the hermeneutics of suspicion all the way for Hobbes. And third, glory. Certainly for Hobbes, not the glory of God, but the glory of the self, and the flourishing of the self, the preservation of the self, the promotion of the being of the self over and against the rest. Individuals, therefore, are apt to invade one another for gain. Suspicious of each other, driven by fear, they're vain, led into ongoing conflict. And in such uncertain conditions, argues Hobbes, where everyone is a potential aggressor, making war on others is a more advantageous strategy than peaceable behavior. Wow, so it seems a step further even than Niccolo Machiavelli with Hobbes, that given this hermeneutics of suspicion and the state of radical diffidence vis-a-vis my neighbor, I must wage war in a constant way in order that I would not be overtaken. If I go about in a kind of peaceful, keep to myself existence, before I know it, I will be attacked. I will be overtaken. So I have to try to exercise a kind of domination over others in order to promote my continued survival. These ideas really go along with going back to St. Augustine and this concept of libido dominandi, this lust for domination, a kind of lust for power. It will fuel that passion, that libido for domination. And then if we couple these kind of ideas with someone later on in history like Charles Darwin, we get this ideology of a survival of the fittest mentality. And if you want to survive, you have to dominate the other. Pure and simple. In economics, in politics, in daily activity. It's a very competitive concept. Again, a kind of zero-sum game, as if there's not enough to go around. And in order for me to get enough, I must take from my neighbor. So, wow. We think of these ideas contributing also to colonialism, the colonization of various territories around the world, and the English, arguably the most prolific at colonizing up now into the modern world. The fact that I'm speaking English on this video in the United States of America is evidence of the power of these theories, this thought, and as events throughout human history. So there's ambiguity with all this. There's a kind of ambivalence with what I'm saying, but I think these things connect nevertheless. Page 168, middle of the page. Hobbes does not consider human beings whom he asserts in his theoretical model to be egoistic, antisocial, and driven by passions, and whose identities he thus constructs to be capable of improvement. So Hobbes doesn't consider human beings to be capable of improvement, to be capable of doing anything other than living according to the spirit of competition, self-assertion, self-ambition, and diffidence, radical distrust of the other. His deterministic account of human behavior, which is grounded in the mechanistic view of modern science, does not allow for any meaningful moral choice. We're purely determined creatures, morally. Without a central authority having sufficient power to keep individuals in check, human life would be, quoting Leviathan, chapter 13, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And the state of war would continue to be the prevailing condition of humankind. It's very interesting when we watch something like the Discovery Channel or similar kinds of programming. We see a lot of predation happening. Cheetahs, going after an ostrich, or a lion going after the zebra. And it's very interesting in this Planet Earth programming, how when we combine these kind of scenes from the rest of the world of nature, and if we start to interpret ourselves as simply rather sophisticated animals, and almost like the best we can do is prey on each other. That's the concept, I think, in the image we're getting in what Hobbes is saying here, that the state of nature is on its own by itself without any supreme political authority moderating all of these things amongst human beings. The state of nature is anarchic, and it'd be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Not much different than what's going on with all these other animal species. So, page 169, about 15 lines down, the sole source of justice for Hobbes and morality is not the individual, is not natural law, is not virtue theory. It is the state. The state as an objective, scientific fact, concept. Rather than being moral laws, the Hobbesian laws of nature are dictates of reason, or prudential rules that appeal to self-interest. Page 170, the last full paragraph. The Hobbesian social contract thus involves the act of transferring rights and the simultaneous creation of a party, the sovereign, to the beneficiary of this transfer. So this is the beginning of social contract theory, which will be seen also in the work of John Locke, but in different ways. But Hobbes' concept of a contract, a social contract, that all of us individuals of civil society would in a sense be making a contract with the supreme political authority, the sovereign, the ruler, in order to promote our own self-interests. So it's a kind of contract. We give the supreme ruler power and absolute power, and as much as we realize this is prudent for the promotion of our own self-interest as individuals, that we wouldn't destroy each other. Without this supreme absolute political figurehead, Hobbes is saying we eventually will destroy each other. Just a matter of time. So this allows us to live as long as possible, maybe to age 91, like Thomas Hobbes, and still live according to this geometrical political science that at its heart is individual self-interest, that we could live a long life in a relative peace because of the social contract we make collectively, mutually, with the absolute sovereign. Page 171, toward the bottom, the sovereign must be absolute, or else there is no sovereignty at all. That's a fundamental premise of Hobbes' theory, is that the sovereign must have absolute power and authority in the polis for this to work. Page 172, toward the top. So when we think of the years Hobbes is living again, 1588 to 1679, what's happened here at this time? Not too long ago, the Church of England was formed, King Henry VIII. And now, in the wake of the Reformation and the subsequent wars of religion, the strong and centralized authority of a secular state came to be seen as the most effective remedy for political disorder. That's an important point to realize in this history of the West. The rise of the authority of the secular state as appearing to be the most effective remedy for political disorder. The rise of the modern secular state is happening at this time, and Hobbes' theory is contributing to this understanding of the supreme power of the authority of the secular state. Further down on 172, to quote Leviathan chapter 21, the laws are of no power to protect them without a sword in the hands of man or men to cause those laws to be put in execution. End quote. So to enforce the laws of the state and ensure that its citizens will enjoy peace and security, the sovereign power must be strong, physically strong, militarily strong. The laws are strong to the degree that the sword is present. The last sentence on 172, since the sovereign is not subject to any external limit, his power is absolute. Bottom of 173. Since for Hobbes there are no logical limits to sovereign power, the theory of the abuse of power is wholly lacking in his works. So, because of this calculus of self-interest for Hobbes, the abuse of power is wholly lacking in his works. He doesn't take this into account because the sovereign power must be absolute. This is a prime necessity. As far as the abuse of this power, well, it can happen. I guess it's a risk of the Commonwealth. To promote the Commonwealth, the abuse of power is possible, but it's a risk worth taking because it's the only way to prevent us from devouring each other. This is Hobbes' idea. Page 174, about 8 lines down, beginning with an abstract conception of life as motion and deriving from it a dehistoricized view of human being, all driven by passions, Hobbes reasons consistently to arrive first at the idea of the social contract, and then at a radical theory of obedience. This kind of helps to sum up where we've been so far with Hobbes' thought. Page 175 toward the top. Hobbes' position combines the nominalist ontological assertion that, quote, there is nothing in the world universal but names, end quote, from Leviathan chapter 4. Combining this concept with legal positivism. In the absence of absolute natural standards, what is right is constituted by the will of the sovereign and expressed in the positive laws of each country, of which the sovereign is the only interpreter. Wow. Page 176, middle of the page. The Hobbesian state, pictured as the awesome figure of the monstrous Leviathan, is a collective being of incomparable power to which each individual is subject. So that's the image of Leviathan. Awesome figure of this monstrous Leviathan. The supreme power of the state. Further down, what Hobbes considered indispensable to sovereign power can be summed up as complete control of the sovereign over militia, money, and mind. So what can happen is what Pope Francis has talked about several times: ideological colonization. When the state has supreme control over education of young people and uh, they control the mind of people. And so therefore, whatever is the worldview, the ideology of the ruler becomes the ideology of the state. Ideological colonization, inevitable with this concept. Page 177, several lines in, we become artificial men, according to this Hobbesian political science, a collection of self-interested individuals held together only by contractual ties. This gives rise to materialistic and secularized thought, and all this together gives rise to totalitarian ideologies that we've seen throughout recent human history in the 20th century, these things rising up. Totalitarian ideologies, fascism to a high degree, but these theories also are at work in the opposite extreme, more socialist ideas moving toward communism, though Hobbes' theory is not communist per se. He argues that the absolute sovereign is necessary. There won't be a time when this is dissolved and everyone lives in this peaceful coexistence. But nevertheless, we see political ideology coming out of this, again, materialistic, atheistic anthropology, both in the political right and the political left. So Hobbes altogether is part of the realist tradition. The state of nature is the state of war. Top of 178, in great contrast to Hugo Grotius, he understands international politics as international anarchy. That's the best it can be. Hobbes' political theory, bottom of 178, which assumes that independent states, like independent individuals, are enemies by nature, asocial, and selfish, that there is no moral limitation on their behavior, is a great challenge to the Grotian vision of human sociability and to the concept of the international jurisprudence that it is built on. Top of 181. Coming to the end here finally, a little protracted this video. It's a longer chapter on Hobbes, but a lot of important points to understand and to locate in relation to the previous thinkers we've been dealing with in this course. The Hobbesian conception of a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that is not moderated by any moral limits is an expression of an explicitly indeterminate striving for absolute mastery of the worlds. This unending acquisition providing a theoretical basis for modern imperialism. The supremacy of man over matter, man over nature. And these ideas, again, give a kind of warrant for exploitation of nature. This mastery over the world, absolute mastery over the world, again, combined with the scientific revolution, that if we have atheism, there still is God, but it is man, that is the self. And man becomes this idea of Lord over nature, Lord of himself through the function of the absolute sovereign. It's a very dangerous place to be when we understand progress. in these terms, human progress in these terms alone, without God, without spirit, yes, it gives rise to the modern machine of communism or capitalism. We'll talk more about these things in a couple weeks. Bottom of 181, moving to the end of this video presentation. In his concept of life as motion, Hobbes preconceived the rise of the bourgeoisie, the class composed of unceasingly active individuals engaged in the unlimited endeavor of increasing their property and power. This may be one point Aristotle would smile at, the rise of the middle class, but again, for Hobbes, it's a very competitive middle class, trying to increase their individual or immediate family, or maybe extended family too, property and power. Finally, page 182, to wrap it all up, Karpowitz writes, it would be the task of John Locke to avert some of the unwelcome consequences of Locke's thought and to provide this modern discourse with a moral dimension. So we look forward to hearing from John Locke next week. Thank you so much for tuning into this video presentation. I hope it's been a benefit, and I hope you're doing well during this precarious time of the outbreak of the coronavirus. You remain in my prayers. May I remain in yours, and look forward to talking again soon.